As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
You already know when I bring back a guest to the Malcolm Effect, it's because I'm so excited to be in conversation with them once again and just unpack things. Welcome back, Dr. Aurelien Mondon. Thank you so much for coming back to the Malcolm Effect.
My pleasure. Great to be back on.
Absolute pleasure. Let's go straight into it. Culture wars. What the hell is happening? All across Europe, all across in the UK context, America, we seem to see or hear about a culture war unfolding between young and old, and then some people racialize it, or between rich and poor. No, it's not even between rich and poor. I wish it was between rich and poor, actually. That would be a battle I'll get behind. But when we think of culture wars, what do we owe its genealogy to, I guess?
Well, I mean, it's the good old kind of diversion that the kind of right wing can muster to actually take our attention away from various types of crisis. And you said, a battle between rich and poor. And that's the thing. Sometimes we talk about the battle between rich and poor, but they kind of shift it. And instead of actually talking about the economy and talking about capitalism and talking about economic inequalities and the cost of living, poverty, and all of these things, instead they try to split the working class, they try to split the poor, they try to split the people into various categories, which then prevent them from fighting actually who is responsible for their plight. And in a way, it seems like we are going always in circle and we are always falling for the same old kind of tricks that the right has been using for decades and even centuries, which is splitting us and managing to kind of divide us into little groups fighting each other as opposed to fighting them.
Absolutely. So essentially what you're saying, the right uses these culture wars to mystify and distract us from what the true sources of oppression are, being like, corporate kind of greed, etc., etc.
Absolutely, exactly. And what's fascinating is that most people don't buy it. And in a way, it's a very elitist discourse, both for people who are hyping the culture wars and who are for whom the culture war is self-serving, but also for the opponents to some extent. I think we are wasting a massive amount of energy fighting those culture wars while we should be fighting for a better world. And it seems like we are kind of chasing windmills almost.
I know, because you commented saying, you put a thread up. It was like 4 out of 5 people believe in racial justice. Was that on the Guardian article?
It was, yeah.
And what was your kind of reflections and comments on that?
Well, what I find fascinating is the Guardian putting that out, but then falling for debates that shouldn't be taking place. It's like, the Guardian knows that most people actually have bigger concerns than, say, immigration or the rise of wokeism or cultural race theory or whatever kind of, or statues being, dismantled and things like that. People have other concerns, or most people have other concerns. We live in a time when, poverty is on the rise, cost of living is getting worse. Young people cannot get on the ladder in the UK, for example, on the housing ladder. Most young people feel that their lives is going to be worse off than their parents and grandparents. These are things that for a long time we didn't think we would see happen in societies like the UK, the US, France, and the kind of global north in a way. And so people are worried for their children, people are worried for their grandparents, for their parents, all of these kind of things. And instead, what we're focusing on, or what we're focusing a massive amount of energy on, and when I say we, I'm talking about the people who have access to shaping public discourse. So it could be the media, it could be politicians, but also to some extent academics, is these kind of non-issues that we then end up hyping and making as if they were massive issues. And I found this poll very interesting because The Guardian reports on it. And yet you can be sure that The Guardian the next day or even on the same day will be reporting on some kind of cultural issue, placing it at the center of the agenda, even though really that's not what we should care about. And I think, one of the best examples for that is trans rights at the moment, and the way trans people are being threatened by the culture war and by reactionary voices, even though most people probably wouldn't care. And it's, they have other issues. And yet, we find this kind of enemy and we create this enemy, and people are at the sharp end of that creation of this enemy, and that's incredibly sad for and dangerous for trans people, and it's incredible how
Exactly.
it's pushed by mainstream voices, and it's unforgivable, to be honest.
But what I don't, yeah, no, I totally agree. What I don't understand is why does it seem then, in your kind of research and tracking far right and their kind of output, why does it seem that there's so much cultural capital in being reactionary and asking such disgusting questions about trans people? Like, what is there to gain? What is the right you doing here?
Well, it's a diversion, right? I mean, look at how many crises we are facing at the moment, both nationally, regionally, globally, and so on. There are so many things that we need to reckon with, from the rise of inequality, from, and I'm talking about inequality here within certain countries, but also globally as well. The kind of
Yeah.
things we haven't yet reconciled ourselves with, and we haven't really addressed, the aftermath of colonization, all of these kind of things that we haven't addressed. But I'm even talking about crises that are newer and that are really developing very, very quickly, like global warming, like the resurgence of fascism, and all of these kind of things we don't address. And instead, we are told to think about things that should be non-issues. Unfortunately, they're not non-issues, but they should be non-issues. The fact that trans people should have the right to do whatever they want, it seems pretty obvious. The fact that Muslim women should be able to wear whatever they want should be, again, a non-issue. And yet we are told that, trans people are a threat, or Muslim women are a threat, or immigrants are a threat. And this, of course, occupies our kind of collective brain space almost, right? And what we can focus on. And it shapes the agenda. And so instead of thinking about the environment, or instead of thinking about the environment in a kind of global and equal way, instead of thinking about the past as something that we should look at critically and address through reparations, we think about it through the eyes of the right and far right, and play right into their own hands, obviously, because the way they divide us is to serve their own interests as opposed to serve the interests of all.
But given so how much and I agree with you totally, but I also I guess I always wonder back and forth in my mind, given the influence of, let's say, the likes of a Jordan Peterson, or let's say, and he's putting out his misinformation, or the likes of someone like Ben Shapiro and these, folks, these faux intellectuals, and I shouldn't even call them intellectuals at all, but these people, isn't there something to be said about combating the misinformation, disinformation they put out there, or no?
Well, absolutely, right. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't combat it, and we should absolutely combat the far and the extreme right, because they have a real impact on the people at the sharp end, and they are.
Yeah.
This leads to kind of violence, both symbolic, discursive, and physical violence on various communities. So absolutely, we should combat the far and the extreme right. What we shouldn't do, though, is fall for their narratives in a way and make them look bigger than they are. So what I'm talking about, what we need to avoid, and that's what frustrates me when I see an article like the one in The Guardian that shows quite clearly that actually people don't care about these issues, and people are mostly on the right side of these issues. And by the right side, I don't mean the right-wing side of these issues, but the kind of the more kind of progressive side of these issues when it comes to so-called wokeism in inverted commas. Yeah. Instead, you have The Guardian telling you that, and then you have The Guardian, running campaigns on so-called populism, for example, and giving a massive amount of space to so-called populist figures who, in fact, quite generally are far-right figures, talking about anti-immigration, talking about kind of great replacement, all of these kind of things. And of course, The Guardian is talking about these people in a way that is supposedly opposing them, right? The Guardian is not far right. Yeah. But at the same time, it's legitimizing their position by saying, well, they are a dangerous alternative to the status quo. And they certainly are, but they're also a limited alternative to the status quo. And so we need to talk about them much more carefully without euphemizing their politics, which means we shouldn't call them populist, but we should call them far right, racist, and other more appropriate terms. But we should also not cover them by giving them platforms. We should cover them by deconstructing their ideas, and only do that when it's necessary. And then we should give a much bigger amount of space in our public discourse to other issues as well, so that we don't hype these people, right? Jordan Peterson has far too many followers. All the kind of reactionary intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals have far too many followers, far too much power given to them by various platforms. But that power and that popularity is still incredibly limited, right? And compared to the amount of coverage we give them, it's mad. I mean, just think about it, for example, with the recent French election. We've been
Yeah.
talking about the far right and the Rassemblement National and the Le Pens for decades in France in an incredibly disproportionate manner. And even this time around, we've been talking about the far right in an incredibly disproportionate manner. And the Front National, at the end of the day, got around 27% of the registered vote, which is far too much, right? And we should be
Yeah.
incredibly concerned by that 27% of the people who can vote in France decided to vote for someone whose father was a fascist and who might have changed herself, but many members of her party remain very much attached to the same kind of ideas, and the party itself is definitely a far or extreme right party. So we should be incredibly concerned about that. But we should also remember that 3 out of 4 voters, and that doesn't even include all the people who cannot vote because they're poorly registered or because they're immigrants and so on and so forth, who live in France, pay tax and so on, did not vote for her. So yes, we should worry about this 27%, but we should worry about this 27% and then think about the 3/4 of the population who have rejected that alternative.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that gives us other opportunities to think beyond that, because the problem is at the moment what we have, and that's exactly the same thing we have in the culture war, is 2 sides that seem to be battling it out. The liberal center, which is satisfying no one, which is not addressing the many crises we are facing, environment, economic crisis, various forms of kind of justice that we are not seeing happening. Think about what's happening in the US right now with the Supreme Court, right? The Democrats could have acted to prevent this from happening, and they didn't. So you have a liberal center, and then the liberal center is using the threat of the far right as if, well, if you don't have us, you'll have worse. You'll have the fascists, you'll have Trump, you'll have the far right, you'll have white supremacists. But that's not democracy, right? That's not a solution. We can't just have the least worst of the two. And what we need to do as the left, I think, is really open this all up and say, look, the far right is incredibly worrying and it needs to be combated. It needs to be combated on the streets. It needs to be combated discursively and so on. But it can't occupy our entire brain space. We need to also offer alternatives. We also need to speak for the left, not just against the right and far right.
No, absolutely. And also, I think I was speaking to my friend Deej about this, and I was listening to her in our podcast, my good friend, and she made a point and said, us leftists are so terrible at propaganda. Like, we need more proper leftist propaganda in many ways. But we also need, and I say that half jokingly, but also I find that we need to gatekeep our language. And what I mean by that is we need, like, our terms have meanings. Like, imperialism has a meaning. Imperialism is not just war, any kind of war. War is obviously always bad, but imperialism has meaning. Certain things, our radical language for all too often has just been by the liberal center cannibalized and taken over and repurposed and commodified and sold back to us. And I find that leftists don't do a good job of keeping their language and keeping to the things that really matter for what leftists should stand for, unfortunately. And again, we've become too embroiled in this kind of nonsense culture war of we don't even seem to have any ideas anymore, which we should, but we seem to just be responding to the right, totally responding to whatever the right sets the discourse, and we're always in the back foot responding. And I don't understand why we're so weak in this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. And that's something that I've been thinking about, right? I mean, I spent the last 15 years kind of researching the far right and contextualizing the kind of rise of reaction. But what I've realized as well, and what I found incredibly frustrating, because my work comes, like my work is kind of political in a way, right? I'm not just looking at the far right in some kind of objective and neutral manner. I'm looking at the far right to combat it. But what I've realized in a way, through my work and through reading other people's work, is that quite often our work on the left is reactive. We are reacting against the far right, and we seem to have kind of forgotten to kind of create our own narratives and to kind of create our own ways out of a crisis we are living through. And there are good reasons for that. Some of the good reasons for that is that, well, we don't really have the time to spend to think, very abstractly about hegemony, and we don't have, we can't possibly say, well, we're gonna, take a longer view and wait 40 years to develop a counter-hegemonic project, but because we just simply don't have that time. People are dying. People are suffering. Things could get a lot worse very quickly because of the climate crisis, because of the resurgence of fascism and eco-fascism, because of various things that are taking place right here, right now. So there is no choice for the left but to react to that reaction. But I think we still need to make time for a more ambitious counter-hegemonic project. And to me, what that brings me back to what the far right has done so well to some extent, but again, they've done it so well because they had the time to do it, is, in the 60s, 70s, when far-right politics in Europe in particular was, at an idea. No one was kind of voting for the far-right anymore. There was still this kind of, the Second World War was still very kind of important symbolically to kind of push these ideas into the margins of politics and make them a big no-no, a big taboo in mainstream politics. And the far-right intellectuals at the time, decided to kind of like almost not go back to basics because they never had these basics, but to kind of like borrow from Antonio Gramsci and start thinking about hegemony more carefully. And they played that long game, which was, before we win political power, we need to win cultural power. And from them on, what they tried to do is not to win elections necessarily. They did compete, but some of them didn't even. What they tried to do is kind of gain access to public discourse and, start changing ideas. And so, for example, they moved away from biological racism and they started talking about racism in more cultural terms. It's exactly the same racializing process, of course, but it's a lot more palatable because you can't be compared quite as easily to the Nazis, right? Because you can say, well, I'm not talking about race, I'm talking about culture, or I'm talking about religion, But at the end of the day, the way Islamophobes talk about Islam is not about theology, it's not about religion, it's very much about a racializing process. And this is very clever because in a way it's been lapped up by the kind of liberal center which hadn't really reckoned at the time with actually its responsibility in the rise of various reactionary politics and in the oppressions that have been core to the history of liberalism. And these kind of ideas were not completely alien to liberalism, quite the contrary. And so they were then reabsorbed. And I'm still fascinated by the way many kind of liberals, and we can discuss the word liberal later, and I'm using it kind of, a bit carelessly here because, we want to talk obviously, and I don't want to bore you with various things, but we can come back to that. But the way many liberals are kind of shocked when they see things happen, like, what's happening in the US with abortion at the moment, and how they're like, oh my God, how can this be happening? And it's like, well, we've been sold that idea that progress is almost irresistible, that progress will happen. We've been sold in the early 90s that we had reached the end of history, like with Fukuyama and all that. It was rubbish. And Fukuyama himself agreed it was rubbish. And yet everyone agrees it's rubbish. And yet it still has such a grip on so many people, so many kind of people who have access to shaping mainstream discourse, that they still hold on to that idea that liberalism somehow will protect us in and of itself from reaction, even though a very quick look at history shows that liberalism has never been against reaction and in fact has accommodated reaction very, very well. And whenever there's been progress made, it wasn't because of liberalism, it was because of the people fighting the liberal elite to kind of push equality, to push justice and things like that. Think about the civil rights movement in the United States, think about the various kind of movements for the right to vote for women or for various people and all of these kind of things. This was not given by the liberal elite. This was abandoned by the liberal elite because the kind of counter movement was so strong. And yet we've forgotten about all of that, and we're just relying far too often on liberalism to save us. And we need to go beyond that. We can't just think of liberalism as a bulwark against the far right, because liberalism can certainly accommodate the far right and has in the past, and has accommodated also far right ideas and ideas that are not even far right, like systemic racism, sexism, and so on and so forth, which are part and parcel of not necessarily liberalism as an ideal, but liberalism in practice for sure.
So what is it, if you don't mind me asking, what is it about liberalism that makes it so accommodating to reaction for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's not just accommodating to reaction, it's accommodating to any kind of ideology to some extent. That's the great strength of liberalism, right? Liberalism, for example, if you think about liberalism in the 60s in the kind of global north, and I know that I've been talking a lot about the global north because that's where my research is based, and I think I should qualify it here. But when you look at liberalism in the global north, it was quite flexible and adaptable. And in the 60s, for example, you could see it becoming more progressive in terms of gender rights, in terms of sexuality, in terms of the rights for various minorities and things like that. And so, when there was enough of a push to stay in power, liberals could actually absorb all of this. They were not happy about it necessarily, but they could absorb it. Yeah. And so, that's the thing about liberalism. I don't think we can paint an entirely negative picture of liberalism because progress has happened, and I don't want to kind of whitewash that at all. But just as progress has happened with liberalism, progress can be taken away. And the progress that has happened under liberalism is not because of liberalism in and of itself. It's because of the movement who've pushed that against quite often the wish and the will of liberal elites. And to some extent, this is exactly the same that's happening with reactionary politics. A lot of liberal elites don't want to see reactionary politics right front and center, right? And I think many of them who are talking about abortion right now in the United States are honest about it. They don't want abortion laws to be repealed or anything like that. But at the same time, they've done nothing to prevent it. And they will accommodate this kind of reaction if that keeps certain interests in power.
Exactly. And I think, speaking about the long game, many people have said that the Roe v. Wade isn't just today. This has been from the 70s in the making.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And again, I think we are stuck in this idea that progress is irresistible. And yet, if we look at the last 5 decades, we can see that, this is a lot of the kind of rights that we've achieved are being chipped away. And, it's fascinating to me that people see, 2016, for example, as a major turning point, with the election of Donald Trump, with Brexit in the UK, with the rise of the far right in various other countries. But it's like this kind of presentism is preventing us from actually, seeing that the right has really got their act together quite a few decades ago, and we've been very complacent on the center left in a way, and quite often the center left and the liberal left has been far too harsh on the radical left, preventing actually real change to be enshrined, real change to be pushed, telling the more radical side of the left to say, like, you look, wait, we can't be too demanding, we need to bring everyone together. I mean, just think about Biden's election, right? Like, Biden is elected. What does he say? He talks about reconciliation with the Republicans and with the Trump voters. And it's madness. It's like, how can you talk about reconciliation the day after you're elected when so many people who voted for you have suffered for 4 years of Donald Trump racializing them, demonizing them, and all of these kind of things? I mean, it's madness. We need to be prouder to be on the left. And I don't think, and we need to be more radical.
Absolutely. And I think we have those on the left. I keep telling people, my friends, my comrades on the left, we need to come out the gate swinging. All this kind of cowering, all this kind of, we're embarrassed of our legacy, the socialist experiments of the past. No, come out of the gate swinging, because the right is doing the same, and they present to the world with their ugliness, and we can own our mistakes and say we learn from it. But I totally agree. Yeah. And that's why I can't take anyone seriously who says, hard left, radical left, unironically, I don't take you seriously. No. I can't take you seriously.
Look, I mean, that's absolutely, you're entirely right. I mean, the left has made many mistakes, and yes, let's acknowledge them, but that doesn't mean that we can't reinvent, ways forward that will prevent these mistakes from being made. But exactly. Also, I mean, what is fascinating as well is that how often the left is, the hard left or the radical left, however people call it, is being told, but what happened under Stalin, Mao, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But what happened under liberalism in the 18th and 19th century with slavery or civil rights movement?
Exactly.
And, all of these kind of things. This all happened under liberalism. It's like, and yet liberalism somehow can
what's
be
happening today?
What's happening today, right? And yet liberalism somehow gets a blank slate every time, as if it was like untouchable almost. And I think it's fascinating. And I think we need to be prouder. And I think we need to avoid, again, I mean, it takes us back to the culture wars. We need to avoid falling for right-wing narratives that tell us that the people are reactionary by essence, and this is something that I've researched a lot with Aaron Winter, the kind of the use of the white working class by reactionaries, and how this is a complete kind of myth, and the left has fallen for it. This idea that Trump, Brexit, various far-right parties across the world have been elected by the working class. I mean, it's been rubbished by a lot of kind of analysis, and yet we've fallen for it. And it's fascinating to see that now you get J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, who won the primaries for the Republicans with the support of Donald Trump, but he was the darling of a lot of kind of liberal outlets and center-left outlets in 2016, when he was talking about the white working class and how they've been abandoned and how it's really hard to be white working class today and all that. It's like, well, come on, wake up. Like, how is that white working class? And also, like, what purpose, what interest does it serve to racialize the working class, to racialize the section of the population that is the most diverse? And it's fascinating that people have bought on the left the idea of the white working class when, I mean, it's so incredibly patronizing that the working class or the white working class would have fallen for people like Trump or Nigel Farage, a former stockbroker. rather than actually defending their own interests, as if they couldn't see that these
Exactly.
people are not going to defend their interests. And actually, if you look at the data, yeah, it's not these people who pushed Trump, who pushed Brexit. It's people who had a lot to gain by
Exactly.
these politics, who had very little to lose, and then could argue back to some kind of reactionary ideas. But so I think we need again to reclaim ideas. We need to reclaim our pride in being left wing. We need to reclaim radicalism because we need it more than ever, and also
Exactly.
because the right is being incredibly radical. And somehow we feel on the left that we should just be more moderate, more conciliatory, and it's fascinating because that's not what our enemies are doing.
Exactly. So let me ask you then, Dr. Aurelien, who you're an author, a great thinker, researcher. If Lenin was to come back today and was to ask you to write, he wants you to rewrite what is there to be done for the 21st century. What are you writing in that book?
Ha! Well, I think your, I mean, I think your introduction of me is way too kind, to be honest. And I don't think Lenin would come to me to write that book. There are many people who are much better placed to write it. But I mean, my 2 cents really are, I think what we really need to kind of I think there's lots of solutions, right? I think we know what needs to be done to some extent. I think one of the problems is we don't believe in it. We don't believe in it
Yeah.
enough. We are still again gripped by this idea that history ended in the 1990s and liberalism, capitalism is our horizon and there's nothing beyond it. And we just
Yeah.
need to wake up to that. And I think that means always taking a critical point of view on the kind of current hegemony, which is that kind of liberal capitalism, which has been in place for a very long time, which has been studied incredibly thoroughly, the mechanisms of which we know very well, and yet we are failing to counter through because of various issues, as I said before, because we have to react to the rise of the far right, to the rise of reactionaries, but we can't just react. I think we need to act. So I think what's to be done is to make sure that we react to the far right, that we combat the far right, that we combat reactionaries in an intersectional manner, and never forget that intersectional manner, but also that we need to act, and that we again need to act in that intersectional manner that is not dividing our people between in kind of races, in genders, in sexualities, in ableism, and so on. So I think we need to react to oppression and to the rising tide of kind of oppressive movements, but we also need to act to dismantle oppression altogether and to offer a better future. And I think at the moment we're failing on that last one.
Thank you so much. Such a dope conversation once again. I hope to have you again in the future. I'm going to leave Dr. Aurelien Mondon's socials in the comments. Please get his co-authored book with another guest I had before, Dr. Aaron Winter. I'll also post a book link. Honestly, I can't recommend it enough, guys. Like, please buy the book. Until next time you listen to Mamadou on the Malcolm Effect, please like, comment, subscribe, and drop a rating. Until next time, peace out.